Welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I am talking with Elizabeth Popp Berman. Beth is the Associate Professor of Organizational Studies, Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Michigan. She is a sociologist with a PhD from the University of California, Berkeley. Her main interests are on economic sociology, sociology of science and knowledge, and a lot of her work is on U.S. history, recent U.S. history, and emphasizes the role of public policy. Her latest book, Thinking Like an Economist, How Economics Become the Language of U.S. Public Policy, is our emphasis on this conversation. She was very generous to give me 2 hours of her time, and I enjoyed every second of it. And we talk about in detail her book. We start by talking about the example she gives in the beginning about how the Obama administration didn't go big enough on economic policy. She uses that as kind of like an example and then explains the economic style, what that is, defines it, how it emphasizes efficiency, and how we see this all throughout U.S. government. She gives examples from the Nixon administration and how that was used, the economic style was used in the Nixon administration. Give a nice history of where it started and originated and how it was used in public policy and in various U.S. administrations from the 50s, 60s, 70s, and even until more recently. We talk about how the economic style became institutionalized. We talk about macro and microeconomics. We talk about the Rand Corporation and the Kennedy administration. We talk about how there was a shift to public policy and how we got things like the CBO. We talk about a little bit more modern history with how Reagan and Clinton used the economic style. And then we talk about, are there other alternatives besides the economic style? Beth is an absolutely wonderful person. Her book is fabulous. As I say in the conversation, it really pushed me to consider things I hadn't thought about. I'm obviously not an economist. This isn't my space. And so she does a really nice job in the book, and hopefully, as you can hear in the conversation, of really just explaining the big concepts, getting into details, but not being too granular or confusing. She has such a nice voice for explaining complicated concepts, and she has a really, really sharp way of viewing these things. And it was an absolute delight to talk to her. And I hope everyone is able to go and pick up her book and enjoy the conversation I have with Elizabeth Popp Berman. I'm here with Elizabeth Popp Berman. Elizabeth, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I'm very excited to talk to you. I saw your book many, many, many months ago, and I reached out, and it was so nice, and I've read it, and it's really good. And so I'm so happy to finally talk to you and all of the wonderful things that you say in the book. And so I'm just really, really happy.
Yeah, well, thanks for inviting me, and I'm really glad to have this conversation with you today.
Yeah, absolutely. So before we get into the book, just tell folks who you are, what you do, what your interests are in, what you study, all the relevant points.
Yeah, I mean, so I am a associate professor of organizational studies at University of Michigan. I'm a sociologist by training, and have kind of broad interest in economic sociology and sort of the sociology of science and knowledge production, and obviously in policy making and sort of how expertise gets used in public policy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's wonderful. The book is magnificent. It's obviously a very nice cover. It's nice blue, and this is great. The book is called Thinking Like an Economist, How Efficiency Replaced Equality in U.S. Public Policy. I will be very honest and lay my cards out on the table ahead of time. This was a book that I usually go into books, I try to be very kind of a blank slate, although that's impossible. But I try to come to it with as much objectivity as I can. And I did that with your book. I had no idea really what to expect. And it was super good. There was a few things where I was pushed and challenged, and I said, oh, maybe that's not what I thought it was. Okay, and let me reconsider that. Oh, I could see that point there. So it'll be fun to kind of talk about that. I'm not with economic things, maybe because it's just not my field, or with public policy or things like that. I'm not as married to ideas as maybe other people might be. So I'm a little bit more malleable in that sense. So, but the book definitely was really good for that, and I'm hopeful the conversation will be really cool to kind of flesh all those ideas out. So
that sounds great. That was your reaction.
Yeah, but that all aside, the book's fantastic. The book is very, very good. I've recommended it to people, and so I hope people that listen go out and buy it. It's very, very, very good. Okay, so let's get started. You start the book off, and we're going to talk about what you call the economic style, which is super interesting. You kind of start by talking about some of the more modern stuff, and then, or more recent history, I should say, and then kind of go backwards and talk about some of the historical elements. Much of the, I guess if you think of, we won't include the Biden administration unless you want to. It's maybe too recent. But you start by talking about how there were some horizons that were constricted within the Obama era. Many people talk very positively about the economics that were done. Some people were more critical and say he was too centrist. He didn't do enough. And so, especially I would say the first 2 years of Obama, right? Because he had the super majority and people were like, we're going to get everything done on the Democratic side. What was it about and this might come out later, but what was it about those 8 years that it wasn't quite what it could have been, or what more could have been done considering everything that he was working with?
Yeah, I mean, so, the bulk of the book is focused on this historical stuff, right? On kind of the 1960s to the 1980s. But I open by talking about the Obama administration a little bit because I think it kind of, I didn't want to bring it all the way to the present, right? Like you said, like the Biden administration, I mean, we can kind of talk about what's going on, but it's still very, very fresh and things are changing. But I thought the Obama administration had these really nice instances that sort of illustrate what I'm trying to talk about when I talk about this economic style of reasoning, kind of shaping what the parameters of policy are, right? Shaping the space of the range of policies that we think about. And and I kind of open by talking about this in a couple of different areas, but I think one that is obviously a big Obama administration accomplishment is the Affordable Care Act, right? And so so the Affordable Care Act is it was a historic piece of legislation. It did something that hadn't happened before. It certainly had effects of getting a lot of people onto health insurance who hadn't before. Yeah. But at the same time, it didn't, not only did it not achieve some of the goals that, that progressives might have wanted to achieve of sort of providing, really universal health coverage. It also didn't really, the sort of the campaign for it didn't really start from a position of necessarily even trying to do that, right? The initial goal wasn't, it wasn't like, okay, we're going to start by proposing national health insurance and then kind of negotiate back away from that. It sort of started with the idea that, the best way to try to cover as many people, under health insurance as possible is to, try to, leverage market mechanisms somehow. Let's figure out how we can build an exchange that's going to, keep prices down, really focus on trying to make this relatively efficient process. We're going to try to, maximize coverage, but we'll make sure that, we'll try to ensure that people are paying some of, carrying some of the weight so that it keeps the cost down relatively. And so, so on the one hand, this is part of what allowed it to be successful. I'm not sure that sort of starting from a much further left position necessarily would have gotten the legislation through. But it also means that, that if you're sort of starting with this this sort of negotiating point that is already in some ways kind of a compromise, then then it tends to over time, as the political process plays out, it tends to be pulled further away from what the original ambition was. And so I think it's a nice illustration of how this broad way of thinking about policy that I'm talking about, actually sort of shapes both the early stages of discussion of what policy options are on the table, right, in ways that end up kind of playing out as policy goes on to get implemented.
Yeah, it's a good example. I remember the healthcare debate very well. The summer of 2009 and fall, and then it fell apart around Christmas, and then got resurrected in January and finally passed in March. the Cornhusker kickback. I remember all that stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
All that stuff we'll read in history books, in 30 years. But I guess what I'm hearing you say, and maybe I'm wrong on this, is that even within economic policy proposals that are done, whomever is in office, I guess, but especially if there's, the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, is just go big, because it's going to get watered down anyways, right? And if it's going to get watered down anyways, well, if you're already coming to the table with a compromise, then you're just going to get less of what you want. Is that about right? Kind of in a very colloquial way.
Yeah. No, I think that's a good summary, and I think and I think what you see is that positions that were sort of once were the starting point within the Democratic Party, and if you look, right, like Democrats have been trying to get some kind of national type health insurance for 40, 50 years. That what the original goals were have kind of been changed and have kind of been reconstructed to be more consistent with this way of thinking. And so, so that involves really thinking about the policy goals in terms of what's going to be an efficient, cost-effective policy, focusing on costs. And, and it really means that you are trying to ensure that that you're structuring things in a way that are going to try to create the right kinds of incentives, right? So you want, you're focusing maybe on, we want to include some cost sharing in there because we want people who can afford to pay for health insurance to pay for their own, and then we'll provide some assistance to people who can't afford it. Whereas, the sort of older approach that was going on was tended to come more from a language of rights. We're going to provide everybody with universal health care. There were sort of political arguments for why it makes sense for it to be universal. And those were kind of no longer really the starting point by the Obama administration, or really even by the Clinton administration, right? Like they're not really, that's not really so much on the table in that era either. Because everybody's kind of really internalized this idea that, that this kind of cost effectiveness, let's think about how to build better markets in healthcare sort of approach is the right way to be approaching policy. So that's sort of the starting point for the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, healthcare is such a tricky thing. I mean, it's a quarter, I think, of our GDP, and we've been trying to do it for, I think it was a campaign point in the 1912 election with Roosevelt. I mean, it's been over 120 years and just never can really happen. I think Johnson tried to do it. I think obviously Ted Kennedy was trying to do it. Nixon almost did it. Obviously Hillary Clinton tried to, that was her kind of campaign. I mean, it just never could get done. And I wonder if that's maybe in this particular case, it's like, okay, there's enough what they called, I don't know if they call them that anymore. There was enough blue dog Democrats in the early part of Obama's first administration. And so it was like, well, we have such a long history with this and it never gets anywhere. And it's so big and all that stuff. But I think that there's something fair. I'll use one example, maybe linking it as in terms of difference, ironically. I guess it was last year. Yeah, it must have been last year. The Biden administration put out a pretty, in some ways bold, in other ways not, proposal for immigration. And I think some people were like, this is great. And some people, I think were like, it needs to do more, but it's better. And then Republicans immediately shot it down. They didn't even consider it. But I mean, which isn't abnormal in that sense. I mean, they're going to shoot down a lot of things what the other side says and vice versa sometimes. But I remember it was pretty bold. I mean, for what he was trying to do. I mean, it was like full citizenship for 11, 12 million. I mean, like, there was a lot of other provisions in there, and the amount of influence and involvement in Mexico and Central American countries was way bigger than I ever saw in anything else to try and get at the root of things. So, maybe that's you could make arguments of the Build Back Better bill, which was, again, very big. I think it initially was 2-point-something trillion. It got down to 1.8. It sort of stalled, rumblings every now and then, and it might, kind of get back up. But, it sounds like that's even though Biden was he's the moderate, right? He's the one that was with Obama for 8 years. It seems the way he's doing things is a little bit more of what you're describing. Maybe not as much as people would like. I mean, he's not Bernie Sanders, but he's doing a little bit more of the kind of let's go big first as a first pass, and then we'll see what we can get watered down, so we actually get something we really want of sorts. Is that
I think that's totally fair. I mean, I think that I think that Biden has definitely both started with proposals that are more ambitious, right? At least as a starting point, even if been kind of mixed success in actually being able to get those through, and also been more willing to challenge some of these conventional arguments, right? That something like the Green New Deal is kind of a very different approach to thinking about environmental or climate policy than with the traditional Democratic position of kind of promoting like cap and trade or some sort of system like that has been. And so so I think it's both maybe some of it's, I think there's multiple things going on, right? Some of it's about lessons learned from the Obama administration. Some of it's just about there's sort of a stronger progressive wing to the Democratic Party than there was 10 years ago, and that's kind of shaping it. But I do think there's a piece of it that's about being more willing to look outside this framework to think about what the best policy options might be.
Yeah, and I think that's I probably wouldn't disagree there. I think it's that's how politics is, for better or for worse. And I think it's important to try and say, how can we get the most of things? You have presidents and administrations only have a certain amount of political capital, and they got to spend it wisely, and hopefully try and navigate it well. So I guess the shift here is, well, how the hell did we get here, right? How the hell did we get here? Well, why are we doing it this way? And how has it been done, I guess, in the past 50, 60 years, which is basically what you describe in the book. So I guess hopefully the kind of how the book goes, we've whetted the appetite of listeners of these things. And so we can say, okay, how did we get here? So you talk about something called the economic style of reasoning. And so what is that? How should governments make decisions? How do we govern markets? So just kind of tell us the economic style of reasoning.
Right. So when I'm using this phrase, like what I'm basically talking about is, kind of first of all, it's a microeconomic way of thinking, right? It's kind of focused on basic Econ 101 kinds of concepts, right? So you're thinking about incentives, you're thinking about trade-offs, you're thinking about efficiency. You're like the measure of good policy is, is this efficient? Is it cost effective? Kind of has a broad orientation towards, definitely not necessarily anti-government, but sort of feeling pretty favorable about market mechanisms as sort of a way to produce good outcomes. So, so maybe government is trying to, structure markets in ways that work better. It could be about smaller government in some instances, just not necessarily. But really, I think the core is that you're thinking about, that efficiency in sort of its various different forms is a really important measure of what makes for good policy. And so then when you're thinking about what kinds of policies should we construct, that's kind of the lens at which you look at them and think about, what's our range of options and what would better and worse policies actually look like.
So it's the key phrase or key word here is this style is trying to look at what's efficient, right? That's the key thing.
If you had to boil it down to one word, I think in a way it's it's a little bit broader than that, right? Because I do think it's kind of a collection of concepts, and it's kind of a it's a loose toolkit for thinking about policy problems. But the way I kind of frame it in the book is around these two sets of questions. One is about like how should government make decisions, and one is about how should we govern markets. And in the first part, it's really about the policies that are going to be good policies are the policies that are cost effective. And so how do we think about what is it the government's trying to achieve? What are the possible means we might have for reaching those goals? And then what's the most cost effective way of actually trying to achieve that? And when you think about it in terms of how should we govern markets, the idea is that what we want to try to do is to promote markets that are going to work efficiently. And so whatever it is that we think is going to take to actually achieve that, in terms of policies or regulations or so on, but that's kind of what you're trying to do. And then you think about, okay, well, do we need to, is there something we need to do to promote competition? Do we need to try to tax externalities in some way? But that's sort of the general orientation of thinking about what good policy is going to look like.
And so this comes down, I guess, another variable then in that piece is how much should government be involved with managing, or I don't want to say manipulating, that sounds bad, but managing markets, right? And of course, you'll have, politically different ideas, right? There's the conservative argument, the libertarian argument, the more progressive argument about how, how much or how little government's involvement is there for markets.
Yeah, and this is where I think you've got quite a lot of range of you've got quite a lot of range of opinions and approaches, that are all within kind of what I would call this broadly economic style, right? Because you could have somebody who is very liberal and who thinks that really, the way that we want to, the way that we need quite a bit of government intervention in order to structure a market that's going to function well. Who might be into sort of relatively technocratic solutions, right? We're going to cap and trade again, I think is a good example of this. We're going to create a market that's going to let us sort of let everybody, trade their emissions credits with each other. This is going to be a nice, efficient way to make this all work better and solve a pollution problem, which is a very economic approach, but is also pretty liberal, right? Or you could have somebody who says that, who agrees that the goal is to try to, promote the efficient functioning of markets, but who doesn't believe that, who believes that creating some kind of complicated, market-like apparatus is actually going to do more harm than good. And so, so I think you can have a range of kind of political orientations that still fit within this broad framework. But what they share is this idea that, that's the right way to think about the problem, right? You're not starting from the idea that, pollution is morally bad and we should just not let people do it. You're not starting with some sort of absolute thing that government is just going to say, companies aren't allowed to pollute. Starting with the idea that if we create the right rules or remove the right rules, then we can kind of encourage this efficient workings of markets.
Well, I think there's a three-headed dragon here with this piece, right? One of them, there could be more, but this is what's coming to mind.
Three is enough.
Three is enough, yeah. One is values and where people place values. I think political agenda comes into place. You'll hear many, congressmen and women say, yeah, I would love to do this, but, it's my party, we can't really go against, so there's that whole thing. And then I think it also becomes on the sort of this kind of, I guess you could say, a true liberal pluralism, which is how much or what's at baseline, what is acceptable for government to control markets, and how do we give some type of flexibility or maneuverability with different states or different local regions where they can have some ways of managing that too. And that's not to say that if you have obviously, some baseline government management of it, that there isn't flexibility. I'm not saying that, but that it becomes my understanding is that it becomes very difficult to kind of say, okay, how do we have those, and I'm sure other variables as well that come into play of saying, what do we emphasize? How do we use this? How do we do this? And that can be, and then people fight about it, right?
Right.
They fight about it and try to figure out how to do that. And it's hard, right? Because on the one hand, it's like, well, look, if someone's democratically elected, whichever side it is, well, give them a chance to do it the way they think. And then, if you don't like it, you vote them out and, you pick the other guy, or other woman. But that, it doesn't entirely work that way, and then that becomes, again, political, right? There's filibuster things in the Senate, things like that. So it just sounds, when you're talking about it kind of 30,000 foot, I think most people would be like, yeah, like there might be liberals that think this way and conservatives that may think this way that may not align completely politically because the economics kind of has a little overlap. But then it just gets messy from there on out.
Yeah. And I think, I think there's some nice concrete examples of what that, what that looks like if you have kind of a different baseline political orientation, kind of within this economic style. Because I think one place that you can see some of these examples show up is in the history of cost benefit analysis of regulation, right? So, I think across the board, without sort of over speaking for all economists, right? But like a pretty broad range of people would say that that if you've got government regulation, that it makes sense to sort of think in some kind of systematic way about the relative costs and benefits of what it is doing as you decide whether it makes sense to have it or not. But then the question, I think, then I think there's a question of, well, what's your sort of underlying assumptions about how likely government is to be able to be effective at doing that? And so, and so if you tend to be somebody who is relatively more favorable to the idea that government regulation is going to have positive outcomes, then, for example, historically what happened is people advocated for what they call cost effectiveness analysis, where the question isn't, are you going to have regulation or not? The question is, okay, we've decided we have this goal that we're trying to achieve. Now let's think about what the most cost effective way to do that is. And so, so it gave you a tool for like choosing between different kinds of government regulation. But it was starting with the assumption that it's fine for government to pick a goal and then create some regulations to achieve it. And sort of, the assumption was that could have a positive outcome, right? If you're coming from a relatively more libertarian, standpoint, and maybe your starting point is that government regulation is just as likely to cause problems as to solve problems, then you might ask for a more stringent cost benefit analysis where you're really saying, should we actually be trying to have this regulation at all, or the cost of it just going to outweigh the benefits in the first place? And maybe your sort of starting point is assuming that you have to find a way to justify even thinking about having the regulation versus not having it. And so so I think that's kind of like a nice concrete example where you see that depending on what your underlying assumptions are about how likely government is to be able to accomplish things, you're going to sort of you could be operating within this framework, but you're going to take a different approach.
Yeah, absolutely. I think of another example that you mentioned in the book is during the Nixon era with environmental programs such as the Acid Rain Act and the Clean Air Act, and you cite how the economic style was seen there. Just as a small footnote, there's an interesting way in which, obviously Nixon gets a lot of shit, and rightfully so. It was pretty terrible in a lot of ways. But first term Nixon, many people have kind of examined a lot of the things he did that would be by many standards, not too far from a kind of liberal position. He was a strange, he was a strange guy in that way politically. And, if you, again, the shadow of Vietnam is over everything. If Vietnam, or if our involvement in Vietnam was not there, just kind of pound for pound, toe to toe, what does, LBJ and a Nixon campaign look like if there's no, it was very obvious what happened in 68, why Johnson didn't win. Majority, I think, was Vietnam, other reasons too. But, what would that kind of look like? Because, it's really, really interesting. There overlap, but then there are differences, how he chose to do things. So you give the example of the economic style with some of the environmental things Nixon did. Maybe just briefly, just kind of just give another example of what that kind of looks like.
Yeah, no, I think Nixon's administration was really interesting, and by the time he was elected, right? I'm sure we'll eventually talk about some of this backstory, but like a lot of the kind of the spread of the economic style happens in the 60s, and so it's already kind of starting to be established in Washington by the time that Nixon's elected. And and when he's elected, the public opinion is still relatively liberal, and he's kind of got like both a more and less conservative wing within his own administration that are sort of competing with each other. And and I think he feels a need in some ways to sort of stake out there's maybe contradiction terms, right? But it's sort of an activist conservative position that conservatives can also do something to solve social problems. He's not sort of starting from a very like sort of strong anti-government stance. And so, so he's really looking for ways to sort of find distinctively conservative solutions that do still involve government in some ways, but that also are trying to tackle social problems. And so you see him doing stuff on poverty, on healthcare, on housing policy, and often what kind of ends up happening is that as he's trying to develop these sort of social policy proposals, so as he's trying to do something like think about, okay, well, what we know that there's a healthcare problem, a health insurance problem. What does my administration's response to that look like? He ends up turning to these offices that were created during the Great Society, that do kind of embody this economic style of reasoning, and that kind of tend to be, they're not staffed by people who are very political at all, but who are maybe a little bit more liberal to begin with. And so he kind of finds himself turning to some of these offices to develop policy proposals. And so, so you end up seeing Nixon propose, for example, a health insurance policy that kind of came out of one of these offices. And it's really, not so far away from what Obamacare would eventually look like, right? Like there's some differences, but like the broad framework of, okay, well, employers are going to give insurance to most people. We're going to have government funded insurance for people who, aren't employed or can't afford it for some reason. We're going to ensure everybody has access, but there's going to be some cost sharing. Those kind of baseline ideas were already there, but at that point, they were something that was seen as being compatible with a Republican position. And the Democratic position was quite different at that point.
It's interesting because I feel like nowadays, well, I don't know what the Republican Party's doing nowadays, but kind of in the Obama era, I guess you could say pre-Tea Party. We'll put it that way. I mean, it's still the case as well, but I mean, they're doing other things too. It just always feels like it's like limited government, big tax breaks. I mean, that's just like, it's like there's not really that much. I'm going to get slammed for saying it's not much. It doesn't seem like there's much thought put behind it. It's just very simple. It's just very like tax breaks, limited government, no regulations. Everyone's happy, and a lot of money on military. And I'm kind of giving the cartoon version of that, but I mean it is some version of that on what's ran. And I mean, I think Reagan kind of did elements of this. Obviously, Bush, and then you have Trump as well, where they're doing that. And so Nixon is again, he's a strange guy in this way politically, because I don't know if it's the Quaker background, I don't know if it was the vice president under Eisenhower, or all of it, but there's interesting motivations behind that of saying, right, like a kind of activist, kind of conservative, not too dissimilar from how Jimmy Carter did things as well, who was also, while he was a Democrat and he was a liberal in many things, deeply fiscally conservative as well. So this is very strange and interesting how it does kind of go across, or at least back then, political party lines. I don't know so much now. I mean, everything's just political now, but historically it's just very interesting how this economic style, we see it in different places. Yeah,
and it's definitely, you see it through Nixon, you see it under the Ford administration, you see it under Carter, and it's kind of a through line through these across parties through these presidential administrations of the 1970s. And then where you really get a shift is with Reagan, right? Because Reagan is Reagan is not interested in taking the approach that Nixon did. He sees himself as having a mandate to, kind of start from a different position, and he really starts with principles that are much more about these underlying values of what government should look like, right? And so, while you had I think both conservative and liberal economists during the 70s arguing for some kind of like cost benefit analysis of regulation, right? And by the time you get to Reagan, it's really not about regulatory reform, it's really about regulatory relief. And so, so the priority isn't really anymore, well, let's figure out what's cost effective and what's not, and kind of use that to guide decision making. It's about regulation bad, getting rid of regulation good. Maybe you're going to use some of that as window dressing to kind of justify your decisions, but that's not really why you're actually taking the action. And so I think Reagan is much more driven by these underlying political values and much less shaped by this economic style.
Yeah. I've had him on the podcast, listeners haven't read his stuff. I mean, Rick Perlstein does an interesting history of conservatism from Goldwater to basically in 1980, Reagan getting elected. And that transformation is so fascinating. It's just from 64 to 80. Wild. It's just wild, that transformation. And it's just exactly what you just said. It's just very much like, how do we diminish regulatory kinds of processes. So this is the one really interesting thing about the book, or at least early on, that was, I never heard it described this way. So at first I was like, okay, what's this? And so it was really interesting how you described it. So you can tell me about the history of PPBS, how it's essential and how, but the thing I want to get at that with that is how you describe the economic style became institutionalized in this period, 60s, 70s. And so how this spread of economic reasoning created a space then for Republicans to use it more strategically, right? So liberals are doing this type of economic reasoning with this style, and then Republicans come in and use it kind of a little bit more strategically. Finally, the main point here is that the institutionalization of the economic style has made it difficult to have these shifting ways. So this kind of goes to the beginning of the conversation we had, right? That we're not going bigger anymore. We're not trying to push the envelope and keep pushing it in the ways that, are appropriate or fair, because that way of doing things is kind of instantiated in the kind of liberal ways of doing things. And so maybe just kind of describe a little bit of that history and then how that has really kind of shifted the guard of sorts of how liberals think economically.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of those like little pieces of history that is sort of obscure, but that, I just felt like was fascinating to learn about and kind of, I think critical to this whole story. But, in the mid 60s, and I could go into backstory, but I'll try to sort of keep it relatively concise. A bunch of guys from Rand, mostly economists, developed this system for cost-effective budgeting, basically. And the idea it was called this thing called PPBS, the Planning, Programming, Budgeting System. And the idea of it was, the way you should think about budgeting is you figure out what your goal is, you think about, different possible programs that are going to get you to that goal, and then you do kind of a comparative cost effectiveness analysis. So like what's going to most cost effectively help you achieve your goal. And that should be how you start thinking about, that should be your starting point for thinking about how an agency or how a particular program should do its budgeting. And so, so this started in the Defense Department. By the mid 60s, Johnson is rolling it out across the executive branch. And, it's kind of a big deal in Washington, and there's lots of trainings, and, everybody's trying to figure out how to use this new system. And on the one hand, it's kind of it's definitely like a practical failure in some senses, right? Within a couple of years, it's very clear agencies can't figure out how to use this. Everybody's just producing lots of numbers that nobody's actually using. People are writing one thing and then they're going through their political back channels and decisions are getting made the way they always have. Right. So it's not very successful on its surface of this goal of rationalizing government. But what it ends up doing is it ends up kind of changing, it creates these lasting changes in Washington. And it does that in a couple of ways. It creates these what I call policy planning offices in most of the executive branch agencies, so that an agency like what was at the time the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare will have one of these offices in it that's kind of got people who are trained in these methods and who are used to thinking about problems in this way. Those end up being important offices in the long run. It creates a lot of demand and new kinds of funding for these policy research organizations kind of around Washington. So some of these are places that already exist, like the Brookings Institution, places like the Urban Institute are created, Mathematica, all these organizations that that are, again, kind of broadly organized around this way of thinking about what makes for effective policy. And then it also basically is responsible for the creation of schools of public policy, which had existed as public administration before, which was much more of a management focused, like good government, making sure the books are lined up kind of approach. But this new discipline of public policy was created to really think about, effectively to think about what cost-effective policy looks like, right? Good policy is policy that cost-effectively allows you to achieve the goals that you want to achieve. And so you have a bunch of schools of public policy created really very much in response to this new system that's being rolled out, this new demand for people who can do this type of analysis. It's got a curriculum that's organized around microeconomics. It trains lots of people who then go and have careers in Washington down the road. And so because you have these new kinds of offices created, you have these new organizations in sort of the space of think tanks and so on, and then you've got these new schools that are training people, this budgeting system that made a lot of noise but didn't really do very much directly in the short run, ends up having this very long-term impact on kind of the infrastructure of Washington.
So the two things here. So the first thing here is, well, if we take the charitable view of this, this was in the early 60s designed, I would imagine, as an outgrowth of something that wasn't there. So if we think 45 is the end of World War II, you have, for some Americans, prosperity in the 50s, but or building that way. But it seems like maybe there was a void of some organizational ability in government, what was cost effective, etc. So there is some outgrowth from this, right? There was a reason why people decided to, hey, let's get our books in order, let's get things a little bit more cost effective. There was some outgrowth of this, yeah?
Yeah, and I think you can absolutely see it as, right, in some way it's a byproduct of the expansion of government. The reason that this takes off is because you do have the Great Society. You have all these new government programs that people are putting a lot of money into, and very quickly also then they're saying, okay, well, what is that money for? How are we using it? Where is it going? We need some tools to try to manage and control this. So in that sense, it's very much a response to that. And I think another chunk of it is in response to a big expansion of government that maybe we think a little bit less about, which is this big expansion of regulatory capacity that kind of follows the Great Society. So, starting in the late 60s, you have the creation of agencies like OSHA. You have creation of the EPA. You have these different sort of new regulatory agencies that are suddenly putting all these new rules on the private sector in various ways. And so, that's not necessarily about directly spending money, but it creates this other kind of pushback from, the companies that are being regulated, or the different sets of people who are being regulated, where they're saying, okay, well, this is having costs for us. We need you to justify this. This is bad. And then, then that sort of creates a demand for more systematically kind of weighing those costs and benefits and trying to use those to, to demand that you have to justify the regulation in terms of those costs and benefits. And so, right, so I think you've got these two different ways that government is expanding between, say, 1963 and 1972 or so. And both of them kind of create a demand for this sort of rationalization that I think is the reason that a lot of it does take off at that moment.
I can hear a lot of my conservative friends, if they're listening up to this point, will say, oh my God, this is the problem. Like, they just always want to just spend money and never pay for it. Now you're saying this cost efficient way was a terrible way to do things. Like, we got to, all these things, right? And again, my counter to that, briefly would be, it just depends on, it's not that conservatives don't do that. They just do it for the things that are important to them. Right. Right. So, to be fair, I mean, I think, again, I mentioned Carter again, because I know he gets a lot of heat for this too. I mean, he got heat for this when he was in office, of not, again, going big enough, being too tight with things, whatever. And just kind of a very parochial view of economics, not his fault. Just not as much exposure. But I guess the idea is we should balance budgets, right? We should not overspend on things, right? We shouldn't be like, yes, let's spend $7 trillion, or what I'm using today's currency. Let's spend all this money and then, not, pay for it right away, or, whatever. If there's a need, we'll just spend it. Like, I mean, there is, I feel like that's the one thing since I've been alive that people will always say is, well, how are we paying for it? Right. And so the I don't know if this was a talking point in the 60s and 70s, but today is, well, you just tax the rich and that will just pay for everything. Maybe. But I think, how realistic is that happening? I don't know. But I guess so in this period, right? How was the idea to pay for certain programs, especially as government's expanding? It's obviously that this way of doing things didn't work. Okay, they trial and error, didn't work, fine. But how is there a need to have some cost efficiency in government?
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's the thing that, right, like, I sort of try to thread this needle in this conversation, right? Is that you like, nobody's going to argue that like the priority is to have less efficiency, right? Like nobody's saying that, yes, right. We want less efficient government. That's the goal. I mean, I think that the case that I would make is that, is that efficiency is a value, right? And that it is one value that, is positive and has consequences, but we often, can have positive consequences, but it can sometimes be treated as sort of a neutral deciding factor, right? But that there is no value in efficiency is just sort of a rational way of thinking about, what's going to be the most cost-effective way to do things. And I think what that does is it can kind of tend to hide the way that efficiency can be in conflict with other values that we might hold politically. And if you're progressive, those might be goals like we want to get healthcare to everybody, and we don't care if it costs a lot because it's just something we fundamentally think is important. And I think right, maybe the conservative equivalent is like, we just need to spend money on our national defense, and it's not really a question of cost effectiveness. It's a question of fundamental values and protecting the nation. But I think that what's important is to sort of be able to recognize efficiency as one value among many possible political values, and the sort of recognizing that tension and recognizing when it is in conflict with other values, instead of just sort of saying, well, this is the reasonable way to do things, and kind of prioritizing competing values is unreasonable because it's unrealistic, or it's not taking these important considerations into account.
I like that answer. I think it is a balance. It's a balancing act, and it is, efficiency isn't I totally agree with you. It's not the only, it's not the supreme value we hold above all other. It's not the master value of sorts, right?
Right.
It's important, but it's not the be all end all. So how, I guess the one thing here again is, so how did this economic style being institutionalized, how did this just kind of break down any progress or growth, and then leave room for conservatives and or Republicans to kind of massage things in different ways?
Well, I think I think some of what happens is that and this is sort of where we get more into like the details of some of the history, but it it kind of gets built into policymaking through these various pathways. Like I've talked a little bit about regulation. Another example of where it really gets kind of integrated into policymaking in this new way is for example, there's this big shift in antitrust policy that takes place kind of between the 1960s and the 1980s, where, antitrust policy, kind of has these 19th century origins where it was about, Standard Oil and railroads.
I was thinking of the turn of the century with McKinley and Roosevelt. I mean, that was their whole, especially Roosevelt, was the whole thing, was antitrust.
Yeah. And so it's sort of, it's motivated by various things, but like a piece of it is about the sort of, fears of corporate power, right? You see these political cartoons from the era of, people who are, these big, rich trust guys who are sort of standing over Congress, kind of calling the shots and so on. And, over the course of the 20th century, antitrust has these sort of competing concerns that are going on. And so, so there's these tensions within it that, on the one hand, if we want to, if there's this piece of it that's sort of about limiting corporate power. And often there's this piece of it that's kind of about protecting small business, sort of a Jeffersonian, fabric of civic life kind of argument. And so it's pursued for those reasons. But at the same time, there's other reasons that are kind of in tension with that. So, this is an argument we hear today, but it's an argument that's been around for a long time that bigger companies are often more efficient, right? And so it doesn't make any sense to protect inefficient small businesses against more efficient larger ones. They should be outcompeted. It doesn't make sense for them to exist. And, prioritizing having small business just because you think it's nice to have them on Main Street or something is not really a good political program. But so for a lot of the 20th century, you've got these competing priorities. They're in tension. The agencies sort of are grappling with them. The courts are grappling with them. But what kind of happens over the course of the same time period, really in the 1970s, is that, you have this shift towards saying, okay, well, the purpose of antitrust, it's not about this political power stuff. It's not about the importance of small business or, it's sort of civic role. It's really about trying to promote market efficiency. And what ends up happening is that although Congress never really writes this into law, the Supreme Court ends up sort of reifying this through case decisions. And so this policy domain that had once been kind of broader and been dealing with a more complex set of questions ends up kind of being redefined in this narrower, more specific way, so that by the end of this period, really legally, the only grounds that you have for making some kind of antitrust challenge is, okay, well, is this going to make the market less efficient? Is it going to raise prices above a competitive level? And so that's quite a different way of thinking about like what the purpose of this policy domain is than had existed for a lot of its history. And, and I would say, people who, economists, people who work in this space would say this is for the good, right? This is because it was the old way of doing it was not very rational. It was political. It, was often based on, like I said, this idea that maybe you were going to protect inefficient businesses. How do you decide when corporate power is actually a problem or not? This is a more sensible way of doing it. But at the same time, as you sort of shift towards this more narrowly economic way of thinking about it, you kind of lose some of the policy tools that you had for thinking about those questions. You lose some tools for thinking about, what how do we think about it? Are there situations when we think that companies have too much political influence or have grown so large that it's creating some other kind of social problem that we need to address? And so I totally forgot what your original question was.
No,
I think
okay.
That was somehow tied to it in the beginning.
Well, as you're talking, I was thinking about it. It says, it seems to me that efficiency was, again, this kind of all supreme kind of value economically. And it is important, but it's not the only thing that's important. And in some ways, it can obfuscate the ability to have
there you go. You remembered what the original question was.
more robust ways of helping all folks, right? And so that leads into my second thought here, which is it seems very true. I mean, what you're talking about, trust and efficiency, small business, big business, et cetera, government, it's really just the kind of ins and outs of the pros and cons of, free market capitalism, I guess, right? Which again, is one of those things where in terms of my reading of history, right? I'm, again, not an economist, but it just seems that, like so many things in the United States, something will be done for a period and a time, and then it's never revamped. We don't update the software, right? It's like we're still using 1930s Social Security or whatever, 1940, whatever it is, and we haven't really updated it. I mean, little things here and there, but it's like we need to, and everyone can, well, we got to really redo that. And it's like, we're going on 100 years now. Yeah. And you and I aren't going to see that stuff. I mean, it's just like, what's going on here? It's the same thing with like, we got to, do tax reform, and no one ever wants to touch that because it's a mess. It's an absolute mess. But we got to, so it's one of these things where like, we'll have like a really good thing, or a decent thing, but then that doesn't last forever because things are changing, and then we don't update with the times. This is one of my biggest things I yell at conservatives about is, it's fine to conserve some things. I understand that. It's fine. I understand some of the arguments of limited government. I can hear it. I understand certain states. I can hear those arguments if they're legitimate, right? They're coming from good faith folks. What bothers me is I never hear what are their options for dealing with problems we have in 5 years, in 10 years, in 20 years. What are the forward-thinking plans they have for our future, right? And this is something that I think more often than not, Democrats are usually more aware of. They're usually concerned about, whether it's the planet, whether it's big tech, whether it's immigration, whether it's things like that. And to me, it's just very small-minded to say, well, we're just going to keep doing it. Let's just go and do it how it was 20 years ago. It's like things aren't static. Like you can't keep doing that forever and ever and ever and ever. You can keep some aspects. I'm not going to sit here and talk terribly about all conservatives or that the model is not right. But I think it's one of those things where you have to look towards the future. You have to see what are the globalization's an issue. Automation is a big problem. There's a lot of things that, as we look in, what's going to happen in 2030 and 2040 and 2050, you have to develop some systems in place that are going to change and evolve. And I think that applies here economically as well. So it's just interesting how maybe efficiency made sense as government expanded. Hey, didn't work so much. How do you reset and kind of have another alternative model that it understands the landscape? And that just doesn't happen. Or it's done in a very like kind of makeshift way, and it's not a complete thing. And that becomes very problematic.
Well, I would say, I think this broader thing that you're pointing to, right? That we create programs, we create policies, and then don't update them. I mean, one, I think it's like a human problem, right? And not even just a U.S. problem, right? That we create, whenever we create some kind of new set of institutions, eventually circumstances are going to change, and like the reasons that they were implemented, the context is going to change. Like the process of implementing them is going to create new problems that result in all kinds. And I suppose, right, the conservative argument might be, well, it's better to just get rid of some of this stuff because just layering, more broken pieces on top of already broken pieces is not gonna improve things. But I mean, I think I guess I feel like I'm going to defend the conservative position now, right? I mean, I think
I can hear that. I mean, I've heard my conservative friends make that argument, and I don't disagree with it. I don't. I definitely think that's the case. But I mean, I think that goes to the bigger point you're making. Well, that's why you start big, right? You try to get things where more people are involved. And then when you get to the compromise, it's not so bad and it's fine, as opposed to, well, we're just going to put another Band-Aid on this, and then we're going to put another Band-Aid on this, and like you have to eventually like take it off. And then some things you have to do a little bit new. You can't hold on to all of these things that you've had since, whatever, and and that's hard, right? I mean, people don't like change. They don't like changing institutions. They don't like doing those things. But it's been an interesting turn, right, in the past 15 years, I guess now, where what was that? That was Obama's campaign. Change is hard, blah blah blah, and then 8 years later, they wanted to change everything and burn it all down and all that stuff. So it's just one of those things where it's interesting how the tides can turn really quickly. Okay, so you talk about in the book, and you can just kind of give us the brief overview, and we can move forward on a few other things. You talk about kind of like macroeconomics and microeconomics. So this is kind of just econ 101 stuff. So maybe just say like, obviously people have maybe heard of the Keynesian approach of macroeconomics. And then there's obviously the advent of microeconomics as well. So this is kind of in that 30s and 40s going into post World War II. These are kind of the two main kind of pillars. Just kind of set that groundwork for that, and then we can kind of come back to some of the other aspects in these kind of smaller groups that we see in the Kennedy and then in Johnson administrations and progressively onward.
Yeah. I mean, I think right. So I did not want the book to convey that the 1960s was the first time that economists had anything to do with government, which would be very much not correct. But so the way I sort of sketch this history out is that you have a couple of waves of economics that kind of interact with and have some influence on government over the course of the 20th century. And this isn't the very first interaction, but there's one big wave that is kind of peaking during the 1930s, and these are what was called the institutionalist economists. And so these folks were doing a kind of economics that does not look like economics from a modern day perspective. So they were not very mathematical. They did like to collect quantitative data, but they were more interested in like descriptive data. They weren't building models and formal theory and doing that sort of thing. They also tended to be progressive. There were a lot of them in the New Deal. They tended to be kind of pro-government. And they were really, important and influential during the New Deal and during that political period. But they are kind of on the, even by the 30s, they're already kind of, their star is a little bit on the decline in economics. And within the discipline, they're pretty much squeezed out over the course of the 1940s and 50s, and they're sort of replaced with newer forms of economists who are more mathematical, more theoretical, and so the institutionalists build some things that have some lasting impact. They created the Brookings Institution, for example, which obviously still around.
Exists. Yeah, still around.
Yep. But they were kind of replaced first by this wave of Keynesian economists who are really macro economists who are interested in these big questions about economic growth and unemployment and kind of what we think of as capital E economic policy, and they came into Washington, really became some there in the 40s and 50s, but really also kind of peaked in the 60s. They maybe had their height of their moment was the Kennedy administration. And they played a big role in giving advice to presidents, sort of, making recommendations about things like tax policy, fine-tuning the economy, that sort of thing. And so they had a sort of a era where they were particularly influential. And then the group that I'm talking about are these microeconomists who are really not so present in Washington prior to the 1960s. And, they're broadly neoclassical economists. The ideas that, the broad ideas that they're working with have been around since the beginning of the 20th century. So it's not that, it's not like there's some new school of thought coming out of nowhere, but they're really moving into policy for the first time. And what really distinguishes them, I think, is that their toolkit is useful for thinking about a much broader range of problems.
Hmm.
So, the Keynesian macroeconomists, they had things to say about fiscal policy or about monetary policy. They didn't really have anything to say about education policy,
Hmm.
environmental policy.
Hmm.
But this microeconomic toolkit was much more broadly applicable because this kind of, again, cost benefit, cost effectiveness way of thinking, thinking about how to structure markets. You could apply this to any part of government. You could apply it to defense policy if you wanted. You could apply it to social policy, and so this it both had the potential to affect a much wider scope of policy, and could really have a deeper impact in some ways by really changing the ways that people thought about those different policy domains.
Hmm. I think it's interesting how many of these models or these ways of doing things, aren't direct. Some are, I guess, but aren't directly a result of their times, but are definitely influenced by the times that they're in, right? I mean, obviously you have the crash of 29, you have the Depression, you have World War II. So and then government expands afterwards. You need to invest. You need to really pump it up and just say, okay, how do we get all this people back to work and people to have better quality of living? So that kind of makes sense why that would be in vogue, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but we see what happens after that, right? Then we have a lot of prosperity, and then people are like, maybe we don't need this so much anymore in some aspects, or we have gaps here on some of these things. We've already talked about PPBS. We haven't mentioned the Rand Corporation. You can if it's relevant here. So I just want to kind of fast forward a little bit to the Kennedy administration, so 60. And so I've talked about it a little. I've talked about Kennedy a couple times on the podcast. And my understanding is that he was, the way he did everything in his or most things in his administration was this very just very analytical. Let's get all the approaches, let's get all the viewpoints, let's keep going and talking about it, let's try. It was very almost scholastic, almost, right? Very much trying to figure out the best, which there's an element of that that's really good, right? You want to get a lot of advisors, you want to get a lot of expertise. I guess why for him specifically was he this kind of very friendly towards expertise, on economics, and how much were these kind of agencies influential in some of this?
Yeah, no, I think Kennedy's an interesting figure at this front, and I've thought about this question of why he was so receptive to expertise, and I'm not sure I have a better answer other than it was just who he was, right? That he was somebody who kind of came out of this Boston, Harvard, Cambridge academic, he lived he had a lot of ties to this broadly academic space. He was very comfortable with it. And so, it was very clear from the time he was running for office that this would be the kind of person he was. And he brought in academics very early and listened to them pretty seriously. I think this maybe connects back to the Rand piece of the story a little bit, but so this one group of people who he really ended up turning to were this group of economists from Rand. And I don't know when people think of the Rand Corporation today, if they think of more sort of the 50s, 60s Dr. Strangelove kind of image, or like social scientists today, you think of the Rand Corporation, they fund health and education research. It's it's a kind of a different place. But at the time, right, Rand worked for the Air Force basically, and it was trying to solve problems that were, mostly broadly around the fear of nuclear war and how do we figure out how to defend ourselves in that case. And so, so economists, it turned out, were pretty good at analyzing these analytical questions that were really about making decisions about choice within constraints. If what we really care about is, being able to protect everybody in the event of a first strike by the Soviet Union, how do we think about where our air bases should be, what the most cost-effective way to ensure that we have all the protection we need is going to be, And they were really good at solving these problems. But by the end of the decade, at the end of the 1950s, they really felt like the Air Force was not listening to them. They were sometimes making recommendations that kind of clashed with just the political interests of the Air Force. And so they kind of cut this deal with the Kennedy campaign, which probably would have gotten them in trouble if it had been found out, because they're supposed to be devoted to the Air Force. But they offered advice. Kennedy liked their approach and took them up on it. And then as soon as he was elected, he appoints Robert McNamara to lead the Department of Defense. And McNamara turns to these guys from Rand, these are his whiz kids, to come and implement their methods in the Defense Department. And so this is sort of one big important moment for kind of the advent of this way of thinking in Washington. And so they kind of come and they make a big splash and start to have an impact.
Yeah, I mean, I'm no fan of McNamara, so
he doesn't have a lot of active fans.
No, I'm not a fan. If I remember correctly, he came from Ford. Is that right? Yeah. And he was all about the numbers, all about numbers. But a lot of times with no context or influence or how it impacts all these other different kinds of things, maybe unbeknownst to him. But, he also had a little bit of, we'll just say a big personality and maybe some kind of arrogance there as well. And a lot of influence. And then he gets all the way up to defense, and he had a lot of authority. He reminds me of a sort of kind of old school now, but kind of how, I'm not directly making the comparison, but just for listeners, he reminds me a little bit of how Paul Ryan used to do this. He used to focus on all the numbers and all of his boards he put up in Congress. It's very little similar. Obviously, they're different personalities and different time frames, but this is kind of that emphasis on quantitative stuff, which is, I love quantitative stuff, but there is other components and other variables that need to be considered. Anyways, I think about the Kennedy piece when I was talking to Fred Lageville about he wrote the biography on JFK. There was so much about his, I think you're right. He was influenced by a lot of people at Harvard, a lot of professors and mentors there, but he was really well traveled during World War II, and he had a very global sense. I mean, he was a kind of globalist of sorts.
Right.
And I think it's almost impossible for people that have either traveled, very well traveled, and I'm saying his dad was the ambassador to the United Kingdom. I mean, he was, diplomat. I mean, he was traveling with, meeting Churchill, and he was rubbing shoulders with all these guys. If you either live in other places, or spend a considerable amount of time, or do a lot of travel, and you're kind of in those circles, I think it would be hard not to have a global mindset. And I mean, there's, in a different way, Obama is the same way. I mean, he lived in, Indonesia, he lived in Hawaii, he's been very much a man of the world. And so people have made that charge at Obama as well. He's a kind of globalist or tendencies there, which is fine, but it's of sorts. I mean, there's pros and cons to that. But I think that with Kennedy, I think it was partly kind of, he is an analytical person, but I think also kind of his experiences of well, let's just get all the data. Let's get all the facts. Let's get all the opinions here. So I have to imagine a lot of his, when he was at Choate, and when he was then at Harvard, when he was then traveling, and when he was, doing all these things, that was somewhere in the kind of wheelhouse of how he was doing things. But, I could be wrong on that. So, and
I think it was also, I'm sorry, I think it was the historical moment too, right? It's just sort of, it's a period of optimism and expansiveness and just, optimism that if we just think hard enough about them, we can solve all the problems, right? And so, coming out of World War II, we had done really impressive things, and the 50s were a time of prosperity for a big chunk of the country, if not all the country, and so, so I think he's coming out of that setting as well.
I would totally agree, and he had a lot of momentum, and he had a lot of youth and excitement, and I think there was a big piece of that. So you have the Rand Corporation, you have PPBS. How do we have the transition from PPBS to public policy programs? and how certain schools become these kind of arms or branches for some of these public policy programs. And then maybe you could also tack on there the origins of the infamous CBO, which we hear about. We definitely heard about during the ACA debates, and we hear about it often, about the estimates they put out and all these things. So you just tell us how we made that shift and then kind of how the CBO fits there.
Yeah. I mean, so McNamara brought these guys to the Defense Department, right? And so they spend about, close to 5 years really focused on the Defense Department and implementing these new budgeting methods there. And they're perceived as being quite successful at the time, right? This is all still pre-1965. The big Vietnam stuff has not really hit yet. And so, so Johnson's read is, hey, this has been a great way of kind of getting the budget under control and kind of gaining more centralized control over it. And we're gonna roll it out more generally. And so that is why it ends up being implemented more broadly. And so it kind of moves from the Defense Department. Then there's an executive order that everybody's got to have this. And so, you have these new agencies like the Office of Economic Opportunity or like the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare that, just like the Defense Department did, try to roll out the same set of methods. Now, there's some challenges in different agencies that the Defense Department doesn't have. I mean, what the Defense Department has is it's very centralized, it's very top down. And so in some ways, it's a lot easier. And there are relatively better defined objectives that they're trying to achieve.
Sure.
It's hard to write down what is the thing that the department, what is it that the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare was trying to optimize, right? So there were some inherent difficulties in sort of translating this outside of the defense context anyway. But that's how it kind of gets going. And then I talked a little bit about how it spread from there, but there's sort of a piece of it that follows that, which is that kind of, I have a subhead in the book that's like analysis begets analysis, right? That when somebody has numbers, they prove to be kind of politically useful. They're sort of a good source for making arguments. They help you make claims. They help you advance your agenda. And then other people need numbers, right? So, if you're two agencies kind of competing for, amounts of the budget, and your competitor over here is getting really good at providing these relatively sophisticated analyses of why they are the right choice for sending your money to, then you're going to find that you too need some numbers, and you're going to start to beef up your own analytical capacity. And so sometimes this is happening across different agencies within the executive branch, but by the early 70s, there's quite a lot of it in the executive branch, but Congress doesn't have the same kind of analytical capacity. And so Congress is feeling like, they can just kind of pull the wool over our eyes, and we don't have any capacity to make our own decisions and really think through this. And so by the mid 1970s, Congress decides to create the Congressional Budget Office, in part so it's got its own analytic capacity to really compete with this. And so, so that's where you get that created. And then by the later part of the decade, it's starting to do some of the things that we understand that that we think of it as doing now. So it's doing things like scoring potential legislation and estimating what it's going to cost and so on. And that's kind of the last, I would say, major change in sort of spreading this broad approach throughout throughout Washington.
Yeah, I mean, I think the emphasis has always been that they're kind of quasi-independent. They're trying to maintain neutrality. They're not left or right, conservative, liberal. They're trying to just split it on the raw numbers. People kind of,
which is never fully possible, right? But that's always been a very conscious strategy.
Yeah.
And Alice Rivlin was the founding director of the CBO, and she very explicitly, like she just said, that we're not going to last if we don't convince people on both sides of the aisle that we are producing something that is of value to them, and that that we are doing it in a relatively neutral way. And so it's never been entirely successful, and sometimes it's been challenged more than others, but that was always explicitly what they were trying to do. And, I think for much of their history, I think have been perceived as relatively straight shooters. I mean, maybe that's eroded some in recent years.
Yeah, for sure. One other thing, I guess, tied with this is just briefly how does you talk about these kind of schools of thought that kind of come out of this, and then we talk about public policy programs and stuff. So you talk about the Harvard Structure, Conduct, Performance framework, and then you also talk about the Chicago Industrial Organizational approach on price theory. You don't have to get into the weeds of it, but just kind of give the overview of how these certain schools had these kind of were outsourced, I guess, for kind of some of these economic types of stuff. And then I guess you can answer that first, and we can just kind of talk a little bit about think tanks like Brookings and things like that for deregulation.
Yeah. So I sort of organize this narrative around that there are kind of two big groups of people who are important in this story. And so one of them is this, these RAND people and the story of PPBS and bringing economics to government in that way. And the other kind of loose network of people who matter are these industrial organization economists. And so, so these are people who are interested in, questions about industry structure or, questions about how to regulate industry. And, and there are kind of different schools of thought within that. So there's sort of a Harvard school that's a little bit more, a little bit more liberal. There's a Chicago school, which is more conservative. But they are also coming to Washington through different pathways in the 1960s. And they're advocating for policy changes in, broadly, I would say, within this realm of questions about like how should we govern markets. And so they've got a lot to say about antitrust policy. They're kind of instrumental in advocating for industry level deregulation in the 1970s. So things like airline regulation, trucking deregulation, so they're the people who are making the case for these kinds of changes. And so they're sort of happening around the same time, but they're interested, and they're communities that overlap and interact a lot with the RAND types, but they're really a little bit focused on a different set of questions for the most part.
I guess the other key thing here is in how we get from the economists then start to devolve from there into these kinds of what we now kind of see as think tanks. I'm kind of getting a little bit ahead, but such as Brookings, what's the conservative one? I think Hoover Institute, AEI. I don't know. I don't know if Pew is as a foundation. I don't know if it's considered a think tank. Maybe elements of it are. I guess the research group is.
Yeah, it's got some research. Yeah.
So we have all of these things that we know now, and there's kind of some big names there. What how does it kind of then spill out into some elements of that of economic data and quantitative analysis in certain organizations like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think. Right. So there were some think tanks that existed by the 1960s. It wasn't a space that was like completely empty. But one thing that happens is that part of this demand for analysis that kind of goes along with the Great Society and the government expansion that it produces also creates a lot of demand for policy evaluation. And so there are a lot of new streams of money that are looking for somebody to spend them by doing some sorts of studies that are going to evaluate policies. And so some of those are things like these sort of classic social experiments about like the effects of a negative income tax. Some of them are really more specific evaluations of, okay, we're starting this program. How do we actually go and measure whether it's doing the thing that we think it's doing? But these new kind of flows of resources really helped this space of think tanky policy research organizations to kind of grow and take off. And it sort of started with the more liberal ones who were, more in line with these Great Society programs. And so, you have things like the Urban Institute being created. But that's kind of counterbalanced in the 1970s by the expansion of conservative think tanks, which again had kind of existed, but are now become larger and better funded, or sort of more professionalized. They develop sort of new strategies for providing faster, more timely information to people in Congress. And by the end of the 1970s, this whole space of organizations that are kind of just outside of government, but that are sort of providing policy advice, providing resources and expertise, has really expanded quite a bit relative to where it was in 1965.
It's so interesting to see the kind of evolution of how these things kind of move through time based on various factors, and how they're how they're kind of organized now for better or for worse. So we've been talking a lot about 60s and 70s, which is to be expected, right? I mean, we're at a time now, 60 years later, 60 plus years later, where now we're really able to have a kind of, we can look in the rearview mirror and be like, oh, this is how we just messed everything up. No, I'm just kidding. Here's some good things, but here's some really, not so good things. We have perspective now. So as we get closer to time, it's weird to think of 1972 as 50 years ago, but as we get closer in time, less stuff to say, although there's other elements. So in the book, you kind of do this, you kind of walk through, not by decade, but certain periods, I guess you could say, as for a lot of things. So one of the things we've mentioned, so maybe we could talk about it here. So we've talked a little bit about the Nixon administration, especially first term, but in the early 70s, social regulation was a huge part of the economic style. And, why was this due to the massive bipartisan legislation passed in that time frame? And so maybe just kind of tee us up for that, and then we can mention a little bit of the Carter administration, some of the things that were done there, and get us to Reagan.
Yeah. So we talked a little bit before about this, this expansion of social regulation that happened in the late 60s, early 70s. And so, so this is like environmental regulation is one big piece of this. So we've got the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and a lot of these pieces of legislation are written with pretty ambitious goals, right? They're written not necessarily to consider costs, and often that's explicitly intentional. Sometimes it is because it's sort of tied to a political theory that if we let costs be taken into account, then that will sort of it'll end up allowing industry too much say, and it will effectively lead to a form of capture. But so they're not necessarily considering costs, and they're often kind of couched in this moral language, right? About pollution being bad, right? That we need to protect the environment is sacred, like this sort of thing. And that legislation all goes through, but it almost immediately provokes a reaction by the companies that it affects. And so you pretty quickly get pushback. This is happening very much under the Nixon administration already, by companies who are saying, this is a bad idea, this is costing us too much. And one of the sort of strategies they use to make that case is they argue for cost benefit analysis of this regulation. And the idea being that if you have to, right, so the charitable view of this is that, like, if you're not counting the cost, it's just like a crazy way to sort of do regulation, and you need to be thinking about what the actual consequences are. The more cynical view is that if they are able to, if regulators have to count costs and benefits, that they'll be able to sort of shape, what's being counted as a cost. They can kind of provide, the government doesn't really have numbers, so they'll get to provide the numbers. It will sort of work in their favor to limit, to minimize what they have to do. And so, so over the course of the 70s, you have this steady push, which is a piece of it is coming from economists and people kind of broadly within that space, who are often fairly liberal and fairly environmental regulation in general, but who really believe that that we need to be taking costs into consideration and looking for cost-effective ways to do this. But they end up kind of becoming sort of unexpected allies with industry, who's also arguing for cost-benefit regulation analysis for reasons of their own. And so, over the course of the decade, and this happens over several different presidential administrations, you kind of gradually move in the direction of pushing to have more of that incorporated into environmental regulation, into health and safety regulation. And sometimes there's sort of legal limits on that because Congress has just said already you can't consider costs in making this particular decision. But a lot of times it's a little bit cloudy, or it's not quite as clear. And so if you sort of change the way that the White House is reviewing regulations, or you sort of change the way that the decisions are made, you can kind of introduce those considerations. And so that's really a set of developments that happens over the course of the 1970s.
Yeah, it's interesting because now I know it's kind of a libertarian right thing, but I mean, I think maybe some liberals too, but the people have this kind of allergy towards regulation in certain, if there's too much regulation, there's going to be it's going to be bad for business. They're not going to be able to grow because all these things. You still hear that kind of language. And certainly that may be true, but I don't think it's universally true. And I don't think it's true in every context. It certainly hasn't been. We see other examples of that. But so, yeah, we talked a little bit about Carter. And, I mean, especially the second 2 years the second 2 years, the last 2 years of his term were just really terrible for, I mean, I think it's just circumstance, and a little bit of his kind of, I guess, the way in which he kind of did things. I talked to Kai Bird recently, and he wrote the biography recently about Jimmy Carter, and yeah, I mean, obviously inflation was terrible, unemployment was terrible, the Iran issue was terrible, but he did have a lot of really awesome things he did as well. But a lot of this was just wrong place, wrong time kind of thing, I think, for Carter. But there was this kind of streak of kind of fiscal conservatism, which pissed his party off and pissed other people off. And again, it does seem to fit within this kind of efficient economic style kind of way of viewing governmental policies here. So then we get to Reagan, right? And so this was very different than previous presidents in some ways, in other ways no. But so how did the Reagan administration use the economic style in service of political values rather than actual source of values, right? He made cuts across the board, just going to cut everything. Right. So how did he do this? What was his kind of way of doing it? I mean, he was a kind of New Deal Democrat, I think. Am I getting the timing right on that? He was a Democrat previously, and then he switched, and he was kind of the lion of conservatism in the 80s. So how either his whole evolution of things, but just when he's president, how did he use the economic style, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, I think what Reagan was able to do really effectively is sort of identify where it was well aligned with the things he wanted to accomplish politically, and in those areas he supported it, and where it was not aligned so well, he did not support it. And so, so you see, for example, that Reagan was very supportive of economic analysis in the antitrust agencies, for example, because at that time, the economics offices were really like they were sort of less enforcement oriented than the agencies as a whole. And so what you have during that period is, the budgets are cut for the agencies overall, but the economics offices grow within them. Like they're the only parts that don't get cut. And so, so that's an area where Reagan was kind of supportive of economic reasoning, because he saw it as kind of serving the goal that he was already committed to of trying to that he thought there was too much enforcement of antitrust policy.
Yeah.
Different area where he took a very different approach was to all the policy analysis that was going on in social policy agencies. And so here, you had people, right? These are the people who Nixon had turned to create his healthcare plan and so on. And, their orientation was really about like, how do we make social policy work more cost effectively? From Reagan's perspective, you just want less social programs, right? You don't want them to be more cost effective. You just don't think they should be there. And so, so these kinds of offices find their budgets to slash. Their staff is decimated. Everybody's kind of demoralized, and they go away. Well, they go away is too strong, but right, they see their influence reduced.
Yes, it's greatly diminished.
Yeah, and then there's some areas where where the story's kind of in between. So for example, in environmental policy, obviously Reagan is not a big fan of the EPA. He cuts their budgets a lot. But like the economists in that agency do a little bit better. Like I said, Reagan is a fan of cost-benefit analysis, mostly because he thinks it's going to lead to less regulation. Again, like happy to just cut regulation if that seems to be the easiest option. But if it seems like a tool that's going to help move things in that direction, then he is friendly to it. Now, there's times when that backfires too, because yes, the cost-benefit analysis sometimes says you should have less regulation, but there's this nice example where the first George Bush as vice president then was in charge of some of this regulatory relief effort, and they thought this was going to be a good solution to the question of unleaded gasoline. So people are worried about leaded gasoline and its negative costs, its negative effects on brain development and all that kind of stuff. And the Reagan administration did not really want to be getting rid of it, or at least phasing it out so quickly. And they thought, oh, well, the cost benefit analysis will help us make our case by showing how expensive this is going to be. In that case, it turned out that the benefits of getting rid of it were so large that, it was just like, it didn't matter. It was just, like 10 to 1 or more in favor of actually getting rid of it. So, so there were moments when it could backfire, but for the most part, they were relatively good at sort of figuring out how it aligned with these broader political goals.
Yeah, I feel like that is a common thread. I mean, it's true for to be somewhat fair to Reagan. I think that's true of every president. They're doing that, but I mean, it definitely shows up a little bit more, I think, in some certain aspects with in the 8 years Reagan was president. So I guess just real quick, jumping to Clinton's administration, where he also promoted the economic style. And which way was he doing this with his what was it called? It was called the third way. No, what was it called? The area of big governments over. What was the thing he called it? It's the third way, right?
Well, the third way is like Tony Blair.
No, yeah. So I'm getting my. It's it was all the like he wanted to like not have a new party, but just kind of ride the line, kind of very much in the center between,
right.
It's going to drive me nuts, but it doesn't matter.
No, I know. I should be remembering this too. And
I'll remember it. But how did he use the economic style here?
Yeah, I mean, so I think, right, like the Clinton, we sort of started out talking about Obama and healthcare, and like Clinton kind of like brings this back around, because I think the Clinton healthcare reform proposals were very much in this space as well. And so, so while in the 1970s, right, the Democrats' position on healthcare was like the Ted Kennedy position, right? We're going to have, we're advocating for national health insurance. It's going to cover everybody. It's not going to be, it's not going to be means tested. Universal healthcare. At this point, this is the point where the modal thinking within the Democratic Party has really changed over this period of time, and it's really shifted towards thinking more about both about healthcare as a market and how do we structure that market better to make it more competitive, as one way of kind of controlling costs, and how do we think about providing that health insurance in ways that are going to be relatively cost effective, which often means that you're not necessarily thinking about universal healthcare. You're thinking about maybe having employers do something and then you provide it to people who can't afford it, something like that. But the real baseline orientation of what you're starting with for thinking about your proposal has already changed by that point in time. So, and so I think, right, Clinton is really, right, like the change that I see, the big change is from 1965 to 1985. Pretty much after that point, like things are relatively stable during the Clinton administration, and maybe move a little bit, but like even during the Obama administration as well. Then after 2016, everything is up in the air again, and who knows? But but that's kind of the way that I sort of think of the time frames.
Yeah, I that makes a lot of sense. I mean, obviously you have W. Bush and then 9/11 and then the two wars, and so that put a wrinkle in everything. Then you have 2008. So, but then I mean, I think I'd say post 2010 things were much better and all the way to 2016 things were much better, and the Obama the last 6 years economically just became progressively better and better. And so obviously now we're getting too close to probably do any type of good commentary or analysis because it's too close. But I guess the idea I have here, so as you've kind of looked at you've talked obviously in the book a little bit about 30s and 40s kind of stuff, but really 1960-ish is kind of until 85 ish is this economic style. How does it not allow for a commitment to absolute principles, right? Obviously we talked about it earlier that efficiency is fine, but not as maybe a core value, right? Maybe as a one of many things. So how is this not preferred, and what would be an alternative, or what would be a more preferable model as opposed to a maybe outdated economic style thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's, I don't think there's one alternative model that's the right model or the best model. I do think that, I mean, our progressives, I'm coming at it from that side of things, that if if what you're trying to do is achieve progressive policy goals, that it makes a lot of sense to start by kind of focusing on what the most fundamental values are. And so, historically, what kinds of stuff has that meant for Democrats? Sometimes it's been about sort of using this language of rights to justify new policies. So, we've got a right to healthcare, right? We've got a right to a clean environment. And that's a language that's very absolute. And, as things end up playing out in the real world, nobody ever has really an absolute right to anything, right? Like you can guarantee a right, but how that's not the same thing as actually saying that that's actually going to be achieved in practice. But if you sort of it's good to sort of recognize those kinds of things as being core motivating values. And, and that's not to say that then it doesn't make sense to think about efficiency as a factor in how you're going to try to think about achieving those things. But yeah, I mean, just as you said, that to recognize that it is one value among competing values, and not to say that, well, we think this would be good to do, but we're going to look for the most, our starting point is going to be that we're going to look for the most efficient way to achieve this goal. And it doesn't necessarily have to be about the language of rights. Sometimes people talk about equality as being a fundamental value in some form, equality can sometimes be in tension with efficiency.
Mm-hmm.
But I think, language of universalism is often a historically been a powerful language that,
Mm-hmm.
we're gonna create some kind of program that's going to apply to everybody, right? Like that, Medicare just applies to everybody over 65, and you don't have to be poor to access it. It's just you've reached that age, you think you should have healthcare, and that's just what we're going to do.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, that really identifying those core values and starting by using those as the jumping off point is something that progressives should do more of. And I think that that conservatives have been able to do that to a greater extent. That if your fundamental value is about liberty, or is about smaller government, or is about strong national defense, that's really that's the thing that's most important to you, and that's what you're gonna prioritize. And maybe efficiency is nice to have too, but that's not necessarily going to be what you start with when you lay your cards on the table.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's things kind of get dumped into kind of these binaries of sorts, right? Well, if you're progressive, you just want to spend everybody's money. Right, and we never pay for it, and it's just a free lunch for everybody. These are kind of the 2-bit versions, right? If you're a conservative, you don't give a shit about your neighbor, you don't care about anybody, you're super self-centered, everything's by your bootstraps. And again, these are kind of pedestrian ways of describing it, but I guess my question always becomes, and this is I have no answer to this. How can people have strong core values that they're passionate about, and they're different, right? And that's what's so hard, because it can feel like they're in opposition. But I think you can take examples from H.W. Bush, right,
Mm-hmm.
who was moderate in some ways, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think you can take examples from certain aspects of first 2 or 3 years of Nixon. I think you can take the kind of amazing organizational ability of the 8 years of Eisenhower. There are in recent memory decent models from conservative presidents and things like that. These guys by a long shot are not perfect, and there's plenty of liberal presidents that are definitely not perfect. But that you can find traces of things where it's like, hey, you can have strong values, and that could be maybe a little bit different than the other side. But how can you try and be considerate of many different ideas and people involved? I'll go back to what I said in the beginning is, what is it that both major parties, I guess, are going to promote economically as a vision for all of the problems that we have facing us in the next 10, 15, 20 years. And
yeah.
And I would agree with you. I think, I don't know how you feel about this, but I agree. I think that there's a streak of progressivism that's really needed, I think, right? Where you keep pushing, so you don't just have any, just kind of doing this moderate liberalism like Clinton was doing. I don't think that's very helpful in a future that's rapidly changing, way faster than any other point. And so I would agree with that. I guess it becomes, well, obviously people aren't going to want to do that. So how do we have a space where we, good faith folks, entertain alternatives to maybe the things that are being pushed, and then where you make a compromise, and it's not you're compromising your entire party, you're compromising your core values. It's like, no, this is part of the process. I'll just give one recent example real quick. People hate him, but I mean, everyone was really upset at Joe Manchin, right? They were really angry, and you know, let's kick him out of the party because he didn't want to, sign off on a bill or whatever, vote on a bill. And I wonder, I mean, he's not a progressive, obviously. He's pretty moderate. And again, when you consider the state that he's coming from and who he's representing, is overwhelmingly Republican, has voted so for a very, very long time. But, he's essentially kind of doing his job. Of course, there's obviously, personal things, special interest things that he has involved as well, which, it's like any politician, he's not squeaky clean. That all aside, I mean, I think I think the point he was trying to make with the Build Back Better bill was, hey, in context, this bill is fine, but this would be a lot of money to spend in 1 year when we have inflation that's 8%. Maybe we shouldn't do this, or we should scale it back down. Where I disagree with him on, I agree with some aspect of that. I can hear his rationale. Where I disagree with him on is what he was trying to cut. And I think that's what most people were upset about with the child tax credit or whatever it was. Mm-hmm. And it's like, okay, but to me, that's like, how can people have these values? How can they have, progressives were very angry, and I get it. And, certain moderates were angry of this. And I think, how can you push for something aggressive like Build Back Better, which is, almost $2 trillion, which is a lot of money. I mean, it's a lot of money. It's a lot of money. And as far as I know, there was no millionaires paying for it, as far as I know. But how do we say, okay, we want a lot of the same stuff, but we do have some values here, and we do have to be mindful of it without beating up the other side or saying all these other types of things. How if the goal is the economic style and efficiency as the one only thing is not always the best, and it kind of can push down kind of equality or rights or things like that. Okay, how do we push for something that can want to do that, maybe not get everything? And I think that's where it can sometimes be problematic, is if people don't get everything, they won't vote or whatever. And obviously you see this on the right all the time, but they won't vote for it, or they'll obstruct it, or they'll start criticizing people publicly. And obviously some of that's politics, but how do we kind of find another way of doing that, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, I think, wow, this is such a hard question, right?
Right. Yeah, this is, I don't have an answer.
I know, and I think, right, like, what you're pointing at here is that we've really had this breakdown of political institutions that allow for that kind of conversation. And, a lot of that is about political polarization, and about people, the parties aren't just about, people with slightly different belief systems who are going to kind of argue about whether we should have a little more government or a little less government, or exactly what form that should take, right? It's people with entirely different, worldviews who have entirely different understandings of what's actually going on in the world. And they feel sometimes like they're not, they're just on completely different pages and have no common ground. So, I think, because I think you're totally right that, there are certainly lots of situations in which people with very different either values or sort of, belief systems about what the role of government should be can come together and find some kind of common ground. But they do have to, for starters, probably not believe that each other are fundamentally evil. Right?
Yes. Yes.
And and they have to be living within a universe where they share some basic assumptions about what the rules are and what the guidelines for that conversation are. And those things have kind of fallen apart over the last couple of decades. So, I think it's not that hard to diagnose the problem. What you actually do to change it is a lot harder to figure out. And that's why I didn't write a book about polarization.
Yes. Well, there's plenty of books written on that.
Yeah.
It's so hard because I don't understand how the United States is the third largest country in terms of, I think, land mass. I could be wrong on that. I might be wrong on that. Maybe we're fourth or fifth. But in terms of population, we're third largest, right? I think it's China, India, and then us. 330 million people. I mean, again, I have many conservative friends. I talk to conservatives. I hear their ideas. I still don't understand how, with a country, with a GDP and an economy and all these things, military, all this stuff, healthcare, as big as ours, with as many people as us, how you can't believe in a strong centralized federal government like that functions. Like you can't have everybody doing their own. That will never not make sense to me. But maybe that's just, well, that's how I show that I'm, I am a liberal, but I don't know what to say. I'm very Hamiltonian. I don't know what to say, but it doesn't make sense to me. I mean, if we were a smaller country, I could maybe see some of those arguments. I just don't know how you couldn't do that. And so, where that breaks down economically is always going to be up for debate. Last question I'll ask you. You've written a marvelous book. What is the thing that, you want people to read and read your book and say, yes, you got it. You got what I was trying to say. What's that one or two things that you want people to kind of really take away from it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. I think, one thing is I would like to denaturalize what we all kind of take for granted, that people just to sort of recognize that this is a thing that we've all sort of internalized and embedded, and it's just been like the way that we think about policy for decades now, and to realize that that is something that wasn't always that way. That was kind of a process and a choice for us to sort of develop that way of thinking about policy, and that means that there's other ways we could do it too, right? Just to kind of open up those options. And I guess, the other thing that I would just want people to take away is that, I kind of try to straddle the fence a little bit with this book, that on the one hand, I'm writing it from a political perspective and I don't hide that perspective, but I would also, my hope is that the people who do not agree with the political positions that I would take in the book, or what my personal policy preference would be, can still recognize the account I'm giving is actually sort of making historical sense, and can kind of read it and be like, oh yeah, I don't agree with what she's trying to do here, advocate for, but this kind of does describe something about really what changed in government in the last 50, 60 years. And so so that's my other hope, is that that comes through regardless of what what your own political orientation is. So we will have to see if that's actually the case.
Well, look, I said at the beginning, and I'll say it again on your behalf, that I'm not a progressive. I'm a center left on most things, I think, including economics. I feel some people say that just so they can make people feel comfortable. I really am. As I just said, a strong central federal government is what I believe in. I do like some progressive policies, but I wouldn't label myself that, but usually center left. And again, I talk to a lot of conservatives. I have conservative friends. I know, libertarian friends. I hear their arguments. And I can say, as someone that is a center lefty, that comes through in the book, right? It comes through that you're giving an account. You're kind of towing the line there. You're not trying to be, it's not biased at all. And it's well written, and the data and the story you're telling comes through. It doesn't feel overly biased. And so I think that's what makes it such a fantastic book. Where can people find the book, and where can people find you and all of your relevant work?
Oh, well, I guess people can find the book in all the usual places. I guess one place is the Princeton University Press website, along with Amazon or wherever else. And you can find me. I'm on Twitter at EPOP with a lot of P's. It's EPOPPPP. You can find my website at epberman.com.
So it's wonderful. Well, look, Beth, I mean, this was such a delight. You're such a wonderful person. I really enjoyed every minute of this conversation. It really, again, it was much as I was reading the book. It always, I got to think about things in a different way, and it's I don't have much disagreement with you on a whole lot of things. Not that I was looking for it, and so this was such a fun conversation. Really, really nice to share
it's
so many things.
It's always a real gift to have somebody, really read and engage with your work. It involves a lot of sitting in a room by yourself. So it's always nice that,
sure,
that really just have somebody to talk to you about it.
Yeah. So I really, really enjoyed it, and I can't say enough thanks for you to come on, and I'm fairly certain everyone will enjoy listening to your work. So big thanks.
Thanks for inviting me.
Of course.